The sound came first, a grinding, guttural roar that rattled the windows and woke me before dawn. At first I thought it was just construction down the block, maybe someone repaving a driveway. But as I stepped onto my porch, barefoot and still groggy, the truth tore through me like a cold blade. They weren't working on the street. They were working on me. A trench, deep, wide, raw with claw marks from heavy machinery, was being dug in a perfect line around my property. My front lawn, once the green pride of my weekends, was shredded into a battlefield. Thick clumps of earth fell in jagged piles, leaving a scar that wrapped like a moat around the place I had built with my own hands. The men in neon vests didn't look at me. They didn't need to. Their orders were clear, and they were just following through. The rumble of the backhoe shook through the ground, vibrating the soles of my feet. Dust clouded the air, coating the hedges, stinging my eyes. It smelled like fresh dirt and gasoline, the scent of invasion, the taste of humiliation. Across the street, neighbors had gathered in small clusters. Some whispered behind cupped hands. Others filmed on their phones, the blue light flickering across their stunned faces. But what chilled me wasn't their silence. It was the smirks on the faces of the people who stood at the corner, clipboards in hand. The HOA board. They weren't working. They weren't even pretending to be concerned. They were watching. They were enjoying it. One of them, a man with slicked back hair and a smug grin I'll never forget, leaned into another board member and chuckled. His voice carried just enough over the chaos for me to hear. That should keep him quiet. Quiet. As if digging a trench around a man's home would silence him. As if turning my castle into a prison would crush my spirit. Their arrogance wasn't just shocking, it was suffocating. I shouted over the roar of the machine, my voice breaking against the steel and dirt. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The workers avoided my eyes. The neighbors averted theirs. But the board didn't. One of them pulled out a slip of paper, waved it like a flag of conquest and called back, "Violation. Excessive non-compliance. Approved by majority vote. Violation." As if my life, my home, my freedom could be reduced to a checkbox on their paperwork. As if democracy could be twisted into mob rule, rubber-stamped by those hungry for power. I wanted to rage, to scream, to throw myself into the pit they were carving and demand that they stop. But I didn't, I couldn't, not then. Because even in that moment, beneath the fury pounding in my chest, a different thought anchored me. They had no idea what I had already set in motion. The trench widened. Dirt fell away in heavy clods. Neighbors gasped as roots of old trees snapped and tore like bones breaking. The machine's bucket clawed deeper, slicing into the earth as if it were carving my property out of existence. My children watched from the window inside, their small hands pressed against the glass, eyes wide with fear. And the HOA just smiled. The board's leader crossed his arms, chin lifted high, basking in the chaos like a king surveying conquered land. His arrogance was unbearable, his confidence absolute. But that confidence was built on ignorance. Ignorance of what I had prepared, ignorance of what I was recording, because while they stood smug and certain of their power, hidden just out of sight, my cameras watched every angle, every smirk, every dig, every whispered order. And as the trench cut deeper into my yard, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The same cameras they mocked me for installing would soon expose every second of their cruelty to the world. But none of them knew. Every second of this intimidation was being recorded. When I first moved into the neighborhood, it looked like the picture of the American dream. Tree-lined streets curled gently around neat rows of homes, each with its own carefully manicured lawn, and the sound of sprinklers ticking rhythmically at sunrise. Children rode bikes in the cul-de-sacs. Parents waved from porches, and every driveway seemed to shine with the promise of safety, security, and pride. It was supposed to be a place where families could grow roots, where the chaos of the outside world stayed on the far side of the gates. That's what drew me in. That's what convinced me I had finally found the kind of stability I had worked my entire life to achieve. At first, it lived up to the promise. Barbecues in the summer, Christmas lights strung across rooftops in December, neighbors who exchanged polite nods when passing by. I thought I had escaped the noise, the endless grind, the cold indifference of the city. But I didn't realize that beneath the calm surface, another kind of storm was brewing, one that no weather forecast could have predicted. The Homeowners Association, 3 words that sound harmless enough, maybe even helpful. an organization dedicated to maintaining order, preserving the neighborhood's appearance, and protecting property values. That's what they claimed, anyway. But the longer I lived there, the more I understood the truth. It wasn't about protection. It was about power. It began with the letters, slipped under doors, tucked neatly into mailboxes, sealed with the HOA's letterhead like a stamp of authority. At first, the notices were small. Grass exceeds allowable length. Trash cans visible from street. Holiday decorations must be removed by January the 2nd. I shrugged them off, complied when I could, ignored them when I couldn't. But the tone sharpened over time, as if the writers were no longer just reminding, but demanding. Each new envelope felt less like a neighborly nudge and more like a court summons. Then came the fines, not outrageous at first, just enough to sting. $50 for the wrong paint shade on the mailbox post. $75 for leaving my car parked overnight in front of my own house. They added up quickly, each one carrying the weight of a warning. You don't really own this property, not entirely. You live here at our mercy. I noticed how the board members walked through the neighborhood with an air of authority, clipboards tucked under their arms like they were generals patrolling conquered land. They didn't smile. They didn't wave. Their eyes scanned for infractions, as though spotting a child's toy left in the yard was the same as catching a thief. And the more I observed, the more I realized this wasn't about lawns or paint colors. It was about control. The HOA wasn't here to protect our investments. It was here to remind us who held the reins. Neighbors whispered about their run-ins with the board. One family had been forced to repaint their house 3 times in 5 years because the HOA decided the shade of beige they had chosen didn't match the character of the street. Another had been fined for having too many guests' cars in their driveway during a birthday party. People laughed about it in hushed tones, but beneath the humor was resentment, simmering like a pot just short of boiling. I tried to stay out of it. I told myself to keep my head down, to play by the rules as much as I could, to avoid drawing attention. After all, I had moved here for peace, not war. I wanted my kids to feel safe playing outside, not to grow up watching their father fight battles with bureaucrats who pretended they were kings. But peace in this place wasn't something you could buy. Peace had to be approved, stamped, and signed off by the HOA board. And the moment you resisted, even slightly, the board made sure you knew the cost. I began noticing the subtle harassment. A neighbor told me she saw one of the board members snapping pictures of my lawn early one morning, crouching low like a detective on surveillance. Another time I found a note taped to my door, not typed, not official, just handwritten in all caps. Follow the rules. The anonymity made it worse. Was it the HOA? A neighbor? A mixture of both? It didn't matter. The message was the same. You're being watched. Still, nothing could have prepared me for the escalation. Looking back, it almost seems absurd how quickly things spiraled, how a fine over lawn height could evolve into open intimidation. But that's the thing about power. It never stops at the limit. It always pushes for more. What I thought was a neighborhood association was really a machine fueled by arrogance and unchecked authority. And once I was in its sights, the machine didn't just want compliance. It wanted submission. The American dream I had worked for, this home, this sanctuary, this community, was slowly twisting into a nightmare. Each new demand chipped away at the idea that I was free to live here on my own terms. The HOA had turned ownership into a leash, tightening it inch by inch until it was harder to breathe. But even then, even when the letters piled up and the fines grew heavier, I thought it was just about money. Just another scheme to squeeze homeowners for every dollar they could. What I didn't realize was that the fines were nothing compared to what was coming, because this wasn't just another HOA letter. This wasn't just another petty violation. What happened next went far beyond paperwork and penalties. It was pure calculated intimidation. And it started with the ground itself. The board wasn't just a group of neighbors volunteering their time. They carried themselves like rulers presiding over a kingdom. Their meetings, held in the sterile glow of the community center, felt less like friendly discussions and more like tribunals. Sitting at the front of the room behind a long folding table, they peered down at residents, as if we were defendants on trial. Every complaint, every request, every question was treated as an inconvenience to their authority. At the center of it all was Richard Hale. He wasn't just the board president, he was the embodiment of everything wrong with the HOA. Tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair slicked back to perfection. Richard wore his authority like a crown. He never simply spoke, he declared. His voice carried with the booming confidence of someone who had never been challenged. And if he ever was, his smile would sharpen, his tone would harden, and the full weight of the board would come crashing down on whoever dared. Richard thrived on rules. He quoted them like scripture, carried the HOA bylaws as if they were sacred texts. At meetings, he would flip to a page, run a finger under a line, and slam his hand down, as though he had just unearthed divine truth. Section 4, paragraph 3, he'd thunder, explicitly prohibits holiday decorations beyond January 2nd. It didn't matter if the lights were still up, only because a family had suffered a death or an illness. Rules were rules, and Richard loved nothing more than enforcing them. He was surrounded by a loyal circle of enforcers, board members who shared his zeal for control. Marjorie, the vice president, was infamous for stalking the streets with a camera phone, snapping photos of children's bikes left on sidewalks, or flower pots that didn't match neighborhood standards. Alan, the treasurer, relished in calculating fines, reminding homeowners how quickly unpaid balances could turn into liens against their properties. Together they operated like a cabal, each one intoxicated by the power of turning trivial preferences into laws. The stories circulated like urban legends, whispered from one homeowner to another in hushed tones of fear and disbelief. A family down the block had been forced to repaint their shutters 3 times in a single year, because Richard insisted the shade of green clashed with the community palette. Another resident, an elderly widow, was fined for keeping a bird feeder in her backyard. The sight of sparrows fluttering in her trees had apparently violated the bylaws on pest attraction. She cried in a meeting, begging for compassion, but Richard only leaned back in his chair, arms folded, lips curled in that smug half-smile. It wasn't just the rules. It was the way Richard wielded them like weapons. He wasn't protecting the neighborhood, he was conquering it. Each violation letter, each fine, each humiliation in a public meeting added to his empire. He fed on compliance, on the bowed heads of homeowners who caved just to make the harassment stop. And if someone resisted, if someone dared to question his judgment, Richard made an example of them. I had seen it firsthand at one of the community meetings, long before the trench. A man named Daniel, a veteran who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 2 decades, stood up to complain about the sudden spike in HOA dues. He spoke calmly, reasonably, asking where the money was going and why expenses seemed to be climbing without explanation. Richard let him speak, nodding with that cold patience of a predator waiting for the right moment. Then, when Daniel sat back down, Richard leaned forward, cleared his throat, and announced that Daniel's fence had been measured and was found to be 2 inches higher than regulation. "It will need to be replaced," Richard said smoothly, "or you'll face daily fines until it's corrected." The room went silent. Daniel's wife gripped his hand, trying to steady him, and Richard just smiled. The lesson clear. Questioning the board came at a price. Neighbors learned to stay quiet. They learned to nod, to pay, to comply, because standing up meant inviting the board's wrath. And nobody wanted to be the next target of Richard's crusade. But silence breeds resentment. Behind closed doors, homeowners raged. They whispered about selling, about leaving, about how the dream had rotted into something suffocating. Yet most stayed, trapped by mortgages, by investments, by the hope that maybe, just maybe, things would calm down if they played by the rules. Richard counted on that. He knew people were too tired, too busy, too afraid to fight. And that knowledge fed his arrogance. For Richard, it wasn't enough to enforce rules. He wanted submission. He wanted neighbors to look at him with the same mixture of fear and respect that a soldier gives a general. Every smirk, every clipped phrase in a violation notice, every public dressing down at a meeting, it was all part of his performance. He didn't just want order, he wanted dominance. And when it came to me, I could feel his eyes on my home long before the trench was dug. The late-night drive-bys, the letters citing microscopic infractions, the condescending notes about community standards, it was all leading to something bigger. Richard didn't just want me to fix a mailbox or trim a hedge. He wanted to break me. The deeper I looked into Richard's history, the more disturbing it became. He had fought tooth and nail to rise to the presidency of the HOA, campaigning like it was a mayoral race, rallying votes by promising to protect the neighborhood's integrity. What he really meant was protecting his control. He had driven out the last president with a smear campaign over a minor accounting error, then swept in as the savior who would restore order. Since then, he had consolidated power, stacking the board with allies and silencing opposition with fines, liens, and public shame. Richard didn't care about the neighborhood looking good. He cared about the neighborhood bowing to him. It was in his eyes every time we crossed paths. The way he looked at my home wasn't with admiration or concern, it was with ownership. As if he believed my lawn, my porch, my walls, all of it existed because he allowed it. And if I stepped out of line, he could just as easily take it all away. Neighbors joked that Richard was the dictator of Maplewood Estates, but behind the laughter was fear. Because we all knew the truth, he wasn't a joke. He was a man who had discovered that power could be carved from pettiness, and he reveled in using it. But men like Richard always want more. Power is never enough. Control has no finish line. And though he had already turned the neighborhood into his personal kingdom, his hunger for domination was far from satisfied. And that hunger would soon push him into dangerous territory. Long before the trench, before the letters and fines, before Richard Hale and his board tried to tighten their grip around my life, there was just one thing I wanted: a place to call home. Not just four walls and a roof, but a sanctuary. A place where my children could grow, where laughter could echo down hallways, where every brick carried the weight of sacrifices I had made along the way. I didn't come from wealth. My parents worked themselves ragged, just to keep food on the table. I grew up watching my father patch leaky roofs and mow lawns in exchange for grocery money, while my mother cleaned houses that looked nothing like the one we lived in. They taught me that nothing worth having came easy. Every dollar I earned carried the weight of sweat. Every step forward came at the cost of something I had given up. So when I got my first job, it wasn't glamorous. Long hours, grueling schedules, the kind of work that left you too tired to dream. But I worked anyway. Each paycheck folded carefully into a savings account that grew slower than I wanted, but faster than I feared. For years, vacations were just a word. New clothes were luxuries. Every spare penny was tucked away, because I had a vision bigger than comfort in the moment. That vision became this home. The day I signed the papers, I remember sitting in my car in the driveway, gripping the keys in my hand until my knuckles turned white. It wasn't just a house. It was proof. Proof that the boy who grew up sharing a cramped bedroom with two siblings could rise above it. Proof that sacrifice meant something. Proof that my children would have more than I ever did. The first night we slept there, I lay awake listening to the silence. No sirens screaming down the street. No upstairs neighbors fighting through thin apartment walls. No fear that the landlord might raise rent beyond what I could afford. Just silence, and the sound of my children breathing peacefully in their rooms. It was the kind of peace that felt earned. Over time, we made that house a home. My wife planted a small garden along the fence, filling it with flowers that burst with color every spring. My kids chalked the driveway in rainbows and hopscotch grids, their laughter carrying across the street. I fixed things myself, sometimes poorly, but always with pride. The crooked shelves in the garage, the uneven paint job in the hallway, the kitchen cabinet that squeaked no matter how many times I tightened the hinges. Imperfections, but ours. The neighbors seemed kind enough at first. We waved, traded polite greetings. We were newcomers, but I didn't feel like an outsider. The neighborhood was clean, orderly, and safe. It felt like the promise I had worked for was real. And though the HOA notices started trickling in almost immediately, small, irritating, but not yet destructive, I convinced myself it was just part of living here. Rules were rules. I could live with that. But what Richard and his board didn't understand was who I really was beneath the surface. They saw an ordinary man, a family guy with a modest car, a patchy lawn, and a tired smile. They assumed I would bow quickly, pay the fines, and nod my head in submission. They mistook humility for weakness. They didn't know about the nights I had stayed awake, staring at bills I wasn't sure I could pay. They didn't know about the years I had worked 2 jobs, sacrificing weekends with my family, so my kids could have school clothes, and I could keep saving for the dream of a home. They didn't know that I had already fought battles against poverty, against doubt, against exhaustion that would have broken most men. I had fought too hard to build this life to let anyone tear it away with a slip of paper marked violation. That house wasn't just lumber and drywall. It was memories woven into every corner. It was my daughter's first steps, taken clumsily across the living room carpet. It was late-night birthday surprises, the flicker of candles casting shadows against smiling faces. It was sitting on the porch with my wife after long days, sipping coffee as the sun dipped behind the trees, believing we had carved out a small piece of paradise in an unforgiving world. So when Richard and his board began circling, when their notices turned from reminders to threats, when their eyes lingered on my property like vultures waiting for something to die, they weren't just challenging me, they were threatening everything I had bled for. And that was something I could never let stand. People often mistake kindness for weakness. I have always been polite, respectful, and someone who avoids conflict when possible. I paid my dues, I kept to myself, I tried to be a good neighbor. But buried deep beneath that quiet exterior is a resolve forged from hardship, a resilience that doesn't bend when bullied. I remembered one winter when I was a child. My father's hands cracked and bleeding from working outdoors in the cold, coming home with just enough to cover the heating bill. He sat us down and said, "Sometimes life pushes you to your knees, but you don't stay there. You rise because you owe it to the ones depending on you." Those words lived inside me, even now echoing in my bones whenever someone tried to break my will. Richard thought he could dig trenches and box me in. He thought intimidation and paperwork would reduce me to compliance. He thought fines would make me fold, that humiliation would send me packing. But he didn't know me. He didn't know where I came from, what I had endured, or how fiercely I guarded the things I loved. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't as powerless as he thought. I had something he couldn't imagine, a lifetime of resilience, a quiet strength and the will to fight back, not with screams or fists, but with patience, proof, and truth, and soon that truth would become his downfall. Because the very foundation of his arrogance, the belief that I would stay silent, was about to collapse. What Richard didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that every act of control only sharpened my resolve. Every threat they threw at me only made me stronger. They saw an ordinary homeowner, but they had no idea they were about to face someone who had nothing left to fear. And as their hunger for control grew, I knew they were going to make a mistake. A big one. One that would tip the balance, push them past the line, and set into motion a chain of events they would never be able to stop, because their power was built on fear. And fear crumbles the moment you refuse to bow to it. The letters had been piling up for weeks, each one more hostile than the last. At first I tried to brush them off. Violation: trash cans visible from the curb. Violation: grass exceeds allowable height by 2 inches. Violation: mailbox paint is faded. The stack grew taller, the fines heavier and the language sharper. What once sounded like polite reminders had turned into threats dressed up in legalese. Words like enforcement action, escalation, and lien appeared with unsettling frequency. I ignored most of them, telling myself it wasn't worth the energy. But then came the notice that broke the silence. I was being summoned to the next HOA board meeting to answer for repeated non-compliance. The phrase stung. Answer for. As if I were a criminal, as if I were guilty of some moral failing, instead of simply living in the home I had sacrificed everything to own. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed. Folding chairs filled the room, neighbors whispering and shifting uncomfortably as Richard Hale and his board presided at the front. Richard sat in the middle, of course, posture stiff, chin lifted, his ever-present binder of bylaws in front of him like a judge's gavel. Marjorie and Alan flanked him, clipboards and pens at the ready. It felt less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a courtroom, and I was the defendant waiting for my sentence. Richard called the session to order, his booming voice silencing the whispers. "Tonight," he announced, "we address the issue of ongoing violations committed by one of our residents. These violations represent a pattern of disregard for community standards and the rules that keep Maplewood Estates beautiful and safe." His eyes landed on me. "Mr. Thompson, please stand." I rose slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. Dozens of eyes turned to me, some sympathetic, some curious, and some eager to see a spectacle. Richard adjusted his glasses, tapped the stack of papers in front of him, and began to read. Failure to remove trash cans within the designated time window, 5 occurrences. Grass height exceeding allowable limit, 3 occurrences. Unauthorized decorative elements, 2 occurrences. Mailbox paint is inconsistent with the community standard, 1 occurrence. Total accrued fines $1,200. He slammed the papers down as if delivering a verdict. Do you deny these violations? The room was heavy with silence. I could feel the weight of expectation pressing down, waiting for me to fold, to beg for forgiveness, to promise compliance. That's what most people did in Richard's courtroom. They apologized, they paid, they walked away. But I wasn't most people. I don't deny receiving your letters, I said evenly, my voice steady though my blood was boiling. What I deny is that any of this rises to the level of harassment I've endured. Trash cans on the curb for an extra half hour. The grass is a little too high after a week of rain. A mailbox you claim doesn't match the shade you prefer. These aren't crimes. They're excuses. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I saw a few neighbors exchange glances, their lips curling in the faintest hints of smiles. Richard's face, however, flushed red. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. Excuses, he thundered. These are violations of the rules every homeowner agreed to when they purchased here. Without enforcement, this community would descend into chaos. With all due respect, I replied, calm but firm, chaos is not children playing outside. Chaos is not a neighbor leaving a trash can out for an extra hour. Chaos is an association that values power over compassion. Chaos is a board that uses minor inconveniences to punish and intimidate. That's not an order, Richard. That's control. The room stirred. Some nodded quietly. Others looked nervous, glancing between Richard and me like they were watching a tennis match. For the first time I could see it. Cracks in the board's authority. People were listening. People were thinking. Richard's jaw tightened. He gestured toward Marjorie, who began furiously flipping through her notes. This homeowner has shown a pattern of defiance, she snapped. If we allow one person to disregard the rules, others will follow. Standards matter. This isn't about control, it's about protecting the value of your homes. Value? I said, my voice rising now. You want to talk about value? What about the value of family memories in a home you've worked your entire life to afford? What about the value of neighbors supporting one another, instead of spying and reporting like enforcers? If the only value you care about is measured in dollars and fines, then this community has already lost what makes it worth living in. The words hung in the air. For a moment, even Richard didn't speak. Then Alan, the treasurer, leaned in, his voice dripping with disdain. The board is well within its legal right to enforce compliance. If fines aren't sufficient, there are other remedies. He paused, letting the implication linger. Liens, legal action, foreclosure if necessary. I heard a murmur of disapproval sweep through the room. Even those who had stayed neutral shifted uncomfortably at the threat. I locked eyes with Richard, and in that moment I understood exactly what this was. It wasn't about trash cans. It wasn't about mailboxes. It was about breaking me. They wanted me humiliated, subjugated, and compliant. And if I refused, they would escalate until I bent or broke. But I wasn't going to break. I'm not afraid of your threats, I said, steady and unwavering. Because no matter how many fines you throw at me, no matter how many letters you send, you can't erase the truth. And the truth is that what you're doing isn't about order. It's about domination. You may think you hold all the power, but you don't know me. You don't know what I'm capable of when you push too far. A hush fell over the room. I could see the unease spreading, not just among neighbors, but on the board itself. For the first time, Richard looked unsettled. Just for a second. Then he masked it with a cold smile, leaning back in his chair. We'll see about that, he said softly, almost too soft for anyone but me to hear. The meeting adjourned with tension hanging heavy in the air. Neighbors whispered as they filed out, some giving me quick nods of support, others hurrying away to avoid being seen choosing sides. I walked out with my head high, but inside I knew the truth. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning, because bullies never stop at words. Not when they think they've been challenged, and sure enough, Richard and his board weren't finished with me. Not by a long shot. And then the HOA decided to make their next move, one that crossed every line of decency. It began before sunrise, with a low growl that at first felt like a thunderstorm rolling across the horizon. The rumble deepened, pulsing through the walls, rattling the dishes in the cupboards. My children stirred in their beds, and my wife appeared in the hallway, confusion etched across her face. "What is that?" she whispered. We both knew it wasn't the weather. It was something deliberate, something planned. By the time I stepped outside, the sound had sharpened into the metallic grind of heavy machinery. A backhoe sat in my front yard, its arm clawing at the earth like a predator tearing through prey. Thick ropes of mud sloughed off the bucket and splattered across my driveway. The smell hit next, a choking mix of diesel exhaust and freshly torn soil, like the scent of a battlefield. At first I couldn't even make sense of what I was seeing. They were digging. Not on the street, not on a neighbor's lot. They were digging around mine. A jagged trench carved its way around my property line, deep enough to swallow a person whole. Grass and topsoil spilled outward in heaps, roots jutting out like snapped veins. The perfect little lawn I had nurtured for years was shredded beyond recognition, replaced with a scar of raw earth that cut me off from the rest of the neighborhood like a moat. The workers kept their heads down, eyes fixed on their task. But the scene wasn't silent. Across the street, neighbors had gathered. They whispered to one another in disbelief, cell phones raised to capture the spectacle. Some were curious, others horrified. So a few I noticed with a sick twist in my gut were smirking, and then I saw them, Richard Hale and his board. They weren't dressed for work. They stood at the curb, arms folded, clipboards in hand like they were inspecting a project they'd commissioned. Richard wore that same half-smile he'd worn at the meeting, the kind that dared me to react, dared me to lose my temper. Behind him, Marjorie and Alan murmured to one another, pointing at the trench like proud architects. My wife appeared beside me, clutching her robe tightly, her face pale. "They can't do this," she said, her voice trembling. "This is illegal." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with rage. I stepped forward, my shoes sinking into the churned mud. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted over the noise. One of the workers glanced at me, guilt flickering in his eyes, but he didn't speak. Richard did. He raised his clipboard like a scepter. "Enforcement of boundaries," he called out, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "According to HOA bylaws, encroachments on common property must be corrected. This is simply a corrective measure. Corrective measure." I repeated, incredulous. "You're digging a trench around my home like it's a prison camp." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Richard only shrugged, turning slightly so the neighbors could see his calm, confident demeanor. "The rules are clear. Non-compliance has consequences. We're ensuring community standards are maintained." Community standards. As if tearing up a man's property in front of his children was just another item on their checklist. My daughter pressed her face against the window inside, tears streaking down her cheeks as she watched the machines claw deeper into the earth. My son stood behind her, his small fists balled against the glass. I felt their fear like a weight on my chest. I moved closer to the edge of the trench, my voice rising. "This is harassment, Richard. You're destroying my property." Richard tilted his head, smirking. "Perhaps if you'd complied with our previous notices, this wouldn't have been necessary." Necessary. The word echoed in my head like a taunt. I wanted to leap across the gap between us, to rip the smugness off his face. But I stayed still, because anger was what he wanted. Anger would make me reckless. And recklessness was how he won. Neighbors were no longer just whispering, they were arguing. A woman I'd spoken to once at a block party was yelling at Marjorie, asking how this was legal. A man with a baseball cap filmed the entire scene, muttering under his breath. Some still stood silent, arms crossed, but I could see their unease. For the first time, Richard's power was being questioned in public, but he didn't care. He thrived on spectacle. He thrived on making examples. And I was his example. My wife gripped my arm. "Please," she said softly, "don't do anything right now." I turned to her and nodded, swallowing the fire in my throat. "I won't," I whispered back. "Not yet." The backhoe clawed deeper, the bucket scraping against buried stones with a screech that set my teeth on edge. The trench now wrapped around nearly 3 sides of the house, isolating us like an island under siege. Every clump of earth thrown aside felt like another piece of my dignity being ripped away. Richard's voice cut through the noise again, this time directed at the crowd. "This is what happens when standards aren't respected. We can't allow one homeowner to jeopardize the value of everyone else's property." He was grandstanding, turning my humiliation into a sermon about community. I met his gaze across the churned mud, and for the first time smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make his smirk falter. Because I knew something he didn't. Inside my home, hidden beneath eaves and inside window frames, tiny lenses watched everything. The cameras I had installed quietly months ago, after the first wave of harassment began. Cameras Richard had mocked me for in one of his letters, calling them unneighborly and paranoid. Cameras that now recorded every dig of the backhoe, every whispered order, every smug glance from the board. I kept my voice steady, loud enough for him to hear, but soft enough that only he would catch the edge in it. "You're making a mistake." His eyebrows lifted, a flicker of curiosity breaking his composure. "Am I?" "You are," I said simply. The machines roared. The crowd buzzed. My children's frightened faces pressed against the window, like specters of everything I stood to lose. But beneath the fear, beneath the anger, a different kind of fire burned. Not panic. Not despair, purpose, because Richard thought he was boxing me in. He thought this trench was the end game, the move that would crush my resolve and force me into submission. But what he didn't know was that every inch of mud his machines churned, every command he barked, every gesture of arrogance was already captured, already archived, already waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. And that moment was coming. The backhoe's bucket slammed into the earth one last time, a shudder rolling through the ground like the closing note of a war drum. Richard turned to leave, satisfied with his display of power. Neighbors began to drift away, shaken and muttering, unsure of what they had just witnessed. My wife held me tighter, her face pale but her eyes bright with a question she didn't dare ask. I looked back at the trench encircling my home, at the mud and diesel and shattered roots, and I made myself a promise. This would not be the story of my humiliation. This would be the story of their undoing. I raised my eyes to the retreating figures of the board, their silhouettes framed against the morning sun, and allowed myself a small private smile. But little did they know, I had eyes everywhere. The morning after the trench was dug, silence hung over my home like a heavy fog. The machines were gone, the workers vanished, but the scar they left behind encircled my property like a wound that refused to close. My children stared at it from the windows, as if a great chasm had opened between us and the rest of the world. My wife tried to keep them busy, tried to hide her trembling hands as she poured cereal into bowls. But I could see it, the fear, the helplessness, the anger, and yet, as I stood in that kitchen with the faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the room, I felt something shift inside me. The trench wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Because what Richard and his board didn't realize was that they hadn't just dug into my lawn, they had dug themselves into a hole too deep to climb out of. I walked through the house slowly, deliberately checking each angle, each hidden spot where I had installed cameras. I had placed them months before, after the first wave of harassment made it clear that I couldn't trust the board. Tiny, almost invisible, tucked beneath eaves, behind vents nestled into corners of window frames. They didn't look like much, but they were powerful. They captured everything, video, audio, timestamps. I sat down at my desk, heart steady now, and opened the files. One by one, the images filled the screen. The backhoe was tearing into my yard. The workers exchanged uneasy glances. Richard was standing tall with his clipboard, smirking like a conqueror. Marjorie is pointing at the trench, whispering instructions. Alan mutters something about making sure he learns his lesson. Every detail was there, every act of arrogance framed in crystal clarity. I leaned back in my chair, my lips curling into the faintest smile. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they had me boxed in, humiliated, silenced. But I had every second preserved, ready to be replayed, ready to be shown to anyone who doubted the truth. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Not the calm of defeat, but the calm of preparation. I didn't need to scream in their faces. I didn't need to march into another meeting and demand justice. All I needed was patience, because the evidence spoke louder than any words ever could. I replayed the clips again and again, noting every detail. The smug grin on Richard's face when he declared it was necessary. The discomfort on the workers' faces as they followed orders they clearly didn't agree with. The murmurs of neighbors, some appalled, some complicit, captured faintly in the background. It was all there. Proof not of enforcement, but of abuse. Not of order, but of cruelty. And as I watched, I imagined the impact it would have when others saw it. Neighbors who had stayed silent out of fear would finally understand they weren't alone. Those who doubted me would no longer be able to shrug it off as exaggeration. Even outsiders, people beyond Maplewood Estates, would see the truth. This was more than an HOA enforcing rules. This was harassment. This was intimidation. This was a board crossing lines that should never be crossed. Still, I knew timing was everything. Too soon and the board might wriggle out of it, spinning the narrative, dismissing it as doctored or misleading. Too late, and they might escalate further, tightening their grip until the damage was irreversible. I needed the right moment. The moment when their arrogance peaked, when their guard was down, when the entire neighborhood's eyes were already on them. So I waited, quietly, patiently. Outwardly, I kept my composure. I waved at neighbors when I passed them on the street. I trimmed what was left of the lawn, ignoring the mud that lined the trench. I went to work, paid bills, lived my life as though nothing had changed. But inside every moment of every day was preparation. Richard must have thought he had broken me. I saw it in the way he looked at me during his evening walks, his eyes scanning my property with smug satisfaction. I let him believe it. I let him believe I was beaten, that the trench had silenced me. That was the beauty of patience. He had no idea the storm gathering just beneath the surface. At night, when the house was quiet and the kids were finally asleep, I would sit at my desk reviewing the footage. I clipped sections, labeled files, and organized them like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Each clip was a weapon, each angle a blade, and together they formed an arsenal that could slice through every lie the board had ever told. My wife would sometimes peek into the room, concern shadowing her eyes. "Are you sure about this?" she would ask softly. I'd nod, not looking away from the screen. They dug the trench, thinking it would isolate us. But what they don't realize is they built their own downfall. The suspense gnawed at me, but it was a fire I welcomed. Because with each passing day, their arrogance grew bolder. They strutted through the neighborhood, boasting about keeping standards high, smirking when neighbors glanced toward the scar carved around my property. And with each boast, each smug glance, I knew the timing was drawing closer. It was almost poetic. They had tried to bury me in humiliation, but they didn't realize they had been burying themselves in evidence. And all I had to do was pull the trigger. At the perfect time, neighbors began approaching me in hushed voices, curiosity outweighing fear. "What really happened with the trench?" one woman asked as she walked her dog. "They said you were in violation, but—" Her voice trailed off, uncertain. I only smiled, keeping my words measured. You'll see soon enough, because they would. Everyone would. The trench became a symbol in the neighborhood. For some, it was a warning. Comply or face the board's wrath. For others, it was a rallying point, a whispered sign that maybe things had gone too far. But for me, it was the line in the sand. A line they had crossed, and one I would never forgive. And so I waited, watching, planning. The footage was ready. The timing was near. Richard and his board continued parading their authority, oblivious to the noose tightening around them. Every second of their harassment was caught in crystal clarity. Every smirk, every order, every cruel word. They thought they had silenced me, but they had only given me the tools to destroy them. And when the time was right, I let the world see exactly who they really were. The moment arrived not with a bang, but with a ripple, small, almost imperceptible at first, then spreading wider and wider until it became impossible to ignore. The HOA had called another meeting, another one of their self-congratulatory assemblies, where Richard Hale and his loyal circle sat at the front like kings on a dais. They expected me to show up beaten, contrite, ready to hand over whatever scrap of dignity I had left. Instead, I walked into that room carrying something far more powerful than apologies or excuses. I carried the truth. The community center was filled to bursting. The trench had become the talk of the neighborhood, and even those who usually avoided meetings were crammed into folding chairs, eager to see what new spectacle would unfold. Whispers buzzed through the crowd as I walked past them, some curious, some sympathetic, some skeptical. Richard sat at the center of the table, arms folded, lips curled into that same smug half-smile he always wore when he thought he'd already won. "Mr. Thompson," Richard said smoothly as I reached the podium, It seems you're here to discuss your outstanding violations. I do hope you've come prepared to cooperate. I met his gaze without flinching. I am prepared, I said, my voice calm even. But not in the way you expect. The murmurs in the room deepened. Richard raised an eyebrow, amused. Do enlighten us. I nodded toward the small projector I had set up before the meeting. My laptop connected to it hummed softly, ready. For weeks I had sorted, clipped, and prepared every second of footage. And now it was time. With one click, the screen behind me flickered to life. The first image froze the room. Richard himself standing in my yard, clipboard in hand, smirking as the backhoe tore into my property. The sound filled the hall, the grinding roar of the machine, the splintering of roots, the gasps of my children faint in the background. The entire room fell silent. I let it play. Scene after scene unfolded. Marjorie pointing with a self-satisfied grin as the trench deepened. Alan muttering about teaching me a lesson. Richard declaring that it was necessary. Every second was time-stamped, every angle captured in crisp clarity. The silence of the audience was broken only by sharp intakes of breath, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional gasp of disbelief. When the first video ended, I turned back to the room. These are not community standards, I said evenly. These are acts of intimidation. These are abuses of power. Richard shifted in his chair, his smirk faltering. This is taken out of context, he stammered, his voice less commanding now. It doesn't show the whole picture, doesn't it? I clicked again. A second video appeared. This time Richard's voice loud and clear as he said, "This will keep him quiet." The audience erupted. Gasps, murmurs, outrage filled the room. People craned their necks, turned to each other, their eyes wide. Richard's face drained of color. "This is who runs your neighborhood," I said, my voice steady, firm, deliberate. "This is what happens when people mistake ownership authority. They dug a trench around my home, not to enforce rules, but to humiliate, to control, to destroy. And I have every second of it on record." The crowd was no longer silent. They were buzzing, alive with anger and disbelief. Some shouted outright, "That's illegal! They can't do that. What kind of board is this?" The tide was turning, and Richard knew it. He raised his hands, trying to calm the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, this is clearly edited," but his words were drowned out as I clicked again. Another clip, this time of Marjorie sneering at a neighbor who questioned the trench. "If he doesn't like it, he can leave. We'll make him leave." The room erupted again, voices sharp, some even standing from their chairs. For the first time since I had moved into Maplewood Estates, the board wasn't in control of the room. I was. I let the footage run longer, showing neighbors in the background, their shocked faces, their whispered disbelief. The evidence wasn't just about me. It was about all of them, about the fear and manipulation that had ruled this neighborhood for years. Every smug gesture, every arrogant word was now public property. When the last clip faded, I turned back, my voice carrying over the roar of the crowd. They thought I was powerless. They thought they could bury me under fines, letters, and trenches. But the truth doesn't need power to survive, it only needs light. And now you've all seen it. Richard stood, his composure cracking. His voice shook as he tried to salvage control. "This is an ambush. He has no right." I cut him off, my tone sharp now. "No right to defend myself against a board that destroyed my property. No right to show the truth? Every moment you've ruled this community. You've demanded submission. But today you answer for your actions." The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't whispers. It was shouts. A chorus of voices rose. "Resign! Step down! Enough!" People who had once bowed their heads in fear now stood tall, their outrage spilling over. The dam had broken. Richard tried to speak again, but his words were lost. Alan muttered to Marjorie, both of them pale, their eyes darting nervously. For the first time they looked like what they truly were. Not rulers, not enforcers, but bullies caught in the spotlight, scrambling for excuses that would never be enough. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The footage had spoken for me. The neighbors' voices rose louder, demanding accountability. Some stood and pointed, demanding Richard step down immediately. Others pulled out their phones, already sharing clips of the footage on social media. Hashtags were forming, posts spreading like wildfire. What had been their weapon of intimidation was now my weapon of truth, and it was unstoppable. Richard slammed his hands on the table, his voice breaking through the chaos for a brief moment. "This meeting is adjourned," he barked, but his authority was gone. No one listened. No one cared. I stood tall, watching the unraveling with quiet satisfaction. For weeks I had endured their harassment in silence, letting them believe they had won. But this was the moment I had been waiting for. The mic drop, the turning of the tide. The exposure of everything they truly were. The board scrambled, shuffling papers, whispering urgently, but their words couldn't erase what the room had seen. They could spin it, deny it, threaten lawsuits, but the truth was out. And truth, once freed, cannot be caged again. I closed my laptop, the room still buzzing with chaos. Neighbors turned to me, some clapping, some nodding in gratitude, others simply standing in stunned silence. The fear that had kept them quiet for so long had cracked wide open, replaced by something stronger: courage. As I walked out of the community center, the crowd still erupting behind me, I felt the weight of the moment settle in. The board's reign wasn't over, not yet, but it was collapsing. Their confidence had shattered, their mask ripped away, their arrogance exposed for all to see. And deep down I knew this was just the beginning. Because if the meeting had sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, what came next would ripple far beyond it. But the shockwaves didn't stop there. The meeting ended, but the storm it unleashed had only just begun. By the time I returned home that evening, the footage was already spreading like wildfire. Neighbors who had recorded snippets from the projector uploaded them to social media, and within hours the videos racked up thousands of views. What had been whispered conversations in driveways turned into trending hashtags: Haggis Trenchgate, Hoti Rants, Stand with the Homeowner. The board's attempt to humiliate me had transformed into their public reckoning. My phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages poured in from neighbors who had once kept their distance, now offering words of solidarity. "I'm so sorry for what they did to you. We should have spoken up sooner. We're behind you." The fear that had kept them silent cracked open like glass under pressure. People who once paid their fines with bowed heads were now speaking freely, their anger raw, their courage awakened. Memes began circulating, mocking Richard and his board. One showed Richard in a king's robe holding a toy shovel, captioned, "His Majesty of Maplewood." Another compared the trench to a medieval moat, complete with drawbridge graphics. Humor had become a weapon, stripping away the board's aura of authority and reducing them to a laughingstock. But it wasn't just neighbors anymore. Local journalists picked up the story. The headline blared across the morning news: HOA digs trench around homeowner's property, caught on camera. Anchors shook their heads in disbelief as the footage played on air, their voices dripping with outrage. Talk radio hosts debated the abuse of HOA power, callers chiming in with their own horror stories. Suddenly, my trench wasn't just a Maplewood Estates problem. It was a symbol of something bigger, something that resonated with anyone who had ever been bullied by an HOA. Reporters came knocking at my door. Microphones thrust toward me, cameras rolling, questions firing. What was it like when you saw them digging? Do you plan to sue? What message do you have for other homeowners facing the same abuse? I answered calmly, choosing my words with care. This was never about grass length or mailboxes, I told them. It was about intimidation. It was about people in power forgetting that rules exist to protect, not to destroy. And if this can happen here, it can happen anywhere. That's why I'm speaking out. Because no one should feel unsafe in their own home. Every outlet ran with it. Clips of the trench spread across platforms, racking up millions of views. National commentators weighed in, some with outrage, others with disbelief, that an HOA could wield such unchecked power. For once, the narrative wasn't theirs to control. It was mine. Back in the neighborhood, the ripple effects were undeniable. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with me now stopped by to offer help. One man volunteered to repair the lawn that had been destroyed. Another offered legal contacts, insisting I pursue charges. A group of families began organizing, whispering about recalling the board, replacing Richard and his cronies with people who actually cared about the community. The fear that had silenced them for so long was gone, replaced by the spark of collective defiance. Richard tried to fight back, of course. He issued a statement claiming the footage was misleading and manipulated, but the words fell flat. Too many people had seen the raw arrogance in his voice, the smug smile on his face as the trench deepened. No amount of spin could erase the image of children crying, as their home was surrounded by mud and machinery. No one was buying his excuses anymore. At the next HOA meeting, the tables had turned. Instead of rows of silent, nervous homeowners, the room overflowed with angry voices demanding accountability. Residents stood one after another, recounting their own experiences with harassment, emboldened by what they had seen happen to me. What once felt like Richard's courtroom now felt like his trial. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The momentum had shifted, and for the first time Richard and his board looked cornered. Their confidence cracked as shouts of "resign" echoed through the hall. Marjorie shrank in her chair. Alan flipped through papers with trembling hands, and Richard himself sat stiffly, his jaw tight, his eyes darting as though searching for an escape. The press showed up to that meeting too. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, microphones captured the outrage of neighbors who had finally found their voices. The board, once so eager to wield authority, now cowered under the glare of public scrutiny. At home, I watched my children laugh again for the first time in weeks. They didn't flinch at every sound outside. They didn't whisper questions about whether we would lose our house. The fear that had hung over us like a storm cloud had lifted, replaced with pride. "Dad," my son said one night, "you beat them." I smiled, shaking my head. "No, son. The truth beat them. All I did was show it." But the story wasn't finished. Because as satisfying as the backlash was, as empowering as the solidarity felt, I knew this fight wasn't just about humiliation or reputation. Real consequences were still to come. The board had crossed lines that went far beyond neighborhood politics. And once the lawyers, the courts, and the broader world got involved, Richard and his allies would face more than angry neighbors. They would face justice. And in the end, the HOA faced consequences they never imagined. When the dust settled, when the cameras had gone, and the shouting in the meeting hall had faded into silence, I finally had a moment to breathe. The trench, though still carved like an ugly scar in my yard, no longer felt like a symbol of fear. It felt like evidence. Evidence that arrogance can be defeated. Evidence that power, when abused, eventually collapses under the weight of its own cruelty. I sat on my porch one evening, the air still carrying the faint scent of fresh dirt and cut grass. My children played on the driveway, their laughter echoing again like it hadn't in weeks. My wife sat beside me, her hand resting in mine, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt something deeper than relief. I felt pride, not in victory over the HOA, but in having refused to bow, because that's what this fight had always been about. Not about grass height or mailbox colors, or the petty rules they waved around like weapons. It was about dignity, about the right of a family to feel safe in the home they had sacrificed so much to build, about the truth that no one, not even a board hiding behind bylaws, had the right to strip that away. I thought back to my parents, to my father's words from long ago, "Life will push you to your knees, but you don't stay there, you rise." That's exactly what this had been. The trench wasn't just a ditch dug into my lawn. It was an attempt to bury me, to bury my voice, my spirit, my resolve. And yet here I was, standing taller than before. The real lesson wasn't about fighting an HOA. It was about fighting any bully who mistakes intimidation for strength. Richard and his board believed they held all the power. They believed their rules made them untouchable. But in the end, it wasn't the rules that saved me. It was true. It was resilience. It was the refusal to surrender, even when the odds seemed impossible. And what mattered most wasn't just what I gained. It was what the neighborhood gained. The silence that had smothered Maplewood Estates was gone. People were speaking again, not in whispers but in voices clear and loud. Neighbors who once lived in quiet fear now waved to one another, stood together, shared stories of their own struggles. The trench had been meant to divide me from them, but it ended up uniting us all. I realized something profound in those days. Freedom isn't the absence of rules. Freedom is the ability to live without fear, to know that authority serves the people, not the other way around. When power is abused, when it's used to humiliate and control, it is no longer authority, it is tyranny. And tyranny only thrives until someone stands up and says, enough. That someone doesn't need to be extraordinary. I wasn't. I was just a man who loved his family, who worked hard, who wanted peace. But sometimes ordinary people are called to fight battles they never asked for. And when they rise, when they refuse to bend, they remind the world of something bullies always forget. Strength isn't measured in how loud you shout or how deep a trench you dig. Strength is measured in how long you endure, how fiercely you protect what you love, and how calmly you stand your ground when everything is against you. As word of what happened spread beyond our neighborhood, messages arrived from strangers. People from other towns, other states, even other countries reached out. Some shared their own HOA horror story. For others, Ply wrote to say they felt inspired, validated, and empowered. My fight had become more than my own. It had become a symbol for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of unjust authority. And that was the greatest victory of all. The trench remained for weeks. A reminder of the battle that had been fought, but it no longer looked like a scar. It looked like a warning. To Richard, to his board, to anyone who thought intimidation was the path to control. The soil would one day be filled in, grass replanted, the earth healed, but the lesson carved into that ground would remain forever. My children, once afraid, now saw their father not as a victim, but as someone who stood tall. And that was the legacy I wanted for them. Not a home without flaws, not a life without struggle, but the knowledge that when injustice comes, you face it. You don't hide, you don't surrender. You fight with truth, with resilience, with dignity. In the end, Richard lost more than authority. He lost the illusion of invincibility. He lost the fear he had relied on to keep us silent, and though the board would continue to exist in some form, it would never be the same. Because once people see the truth, once they find their voices, they cannot be silenced again. As I sat on that porch watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, I felt a deep sense of peace, not because the fight was over, but because the lesson was clear. We had all learned something powerful. No matter how high the walls, no matter how deep the trenches, no matter how loud the bullies shout, ordinary people can and do win, because truth is louder, dignity is stronger, and resilience outlasts them all. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every homeowner, every neighbor, every person who had ever felt trapped by unfairness. The story of the trench was more than a cautionary tale. It was a rallying cry, and though the battle had left scars, it also left something greater: hope. Hope that communities can rise, that bullies can fall, and that justice can triumph even in the quietest corners of America. And as I looked out at my family, my neighbors, my home, I knew with absolute certainty freedom and dignity were worth every fight. The HOA thought they could scare me. They thought the trench would isolate me, humiliate me, bury me beneath fear and silence. But what they didn't count on was the truth, caught on hidden cameras, preserved in every frame, undeniable in every word. What they meant to use as a weapon against me became the very evidence that exposed them. This wasn't just a fight about one home, one yard, or one trench carved into the ground. It was a fight about dignity, about standing tall when someone tries to strip it away. They believed control came from intimidation. But I proved that real strength comes from refusing to bow, from meeting arrogance with resilience, and from letting the truth speak louder than threats ever could. I want you to remember this. The ordinary homeowner is never powerless. When bullies hide behind rules, when they twist authority into tyranny, you can still fight back. Sometimes you fight with words, with proof. Sometimes with nothing more than the courage to say enough. That courage is contagious. It spreads, it unites, and it changes everything. So let my story remind you, whether it's an HOA, a boss, or anyone who thinks fear is power, you are never as alone as they want you to believe. There are always people watching, always people ready to stand with you once you shine a light on the truth. And the louder bullies shout, the harder they fall when exposed. If this story lit a fire in you, if it made you cheer when justice finally cracked through the arrogance, then don't let it end here. Subscribe for more stories where ordinary people stand up to extraordinary injustice. Share this video so others know they aren't powerless. That even in the face of trenches, literal or otherwise, there is always a way to fight back. Because the HOA dug deep, but in the end, the truth dug deeper. And once the world saw it, there was no trench wide enough to contain it. Stand tall, speak out, and never let anyone convince you that your dignity belongs to them. This is your story too, and together we make sure it's never silenced.